I never believed in coincidence until the night I helped an alien on the road, and he revealed the secret of the Shroud of Turin, a truth so staggering it shattered every wall I'd built between heaven and earth. It was one of those desert highways that stretches into forever, the kind where you're alone with your thoughts and the hum of tires on. Asphalt becomes a kind of meditation. I'd been driving for hours through the New Mexico Badlands, running from nothing and toward nothing, just moving because stillness felt like surrender. The moon hung low and impossibly bright, painting the sand and scrub brush in shades of silver and shadow, turning the whole world into something ancient and untouched. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, and beyond their reach, the universe sprawled out in all its terrible beauty, indifferent and eternal. I wasn't looking for anything miraculous that night. If anything, I was looking for proof that miracles had abandoned us entirely. But then I saw it, a shape on the shoulder of the road ahead, collapsed and motionless, and something in my chest tightened with an awareness I couldn't name. At first I thought it was a person, maybe someone whose car had broken down or worse, and my hands were already moving toward the brake before my mind caught up. But as I slowed and the distance closed, the moonlight revealed something that made my breath catch and my rational mind stutter and stop. The figure was glowing, not with reflected light, but with its own faint luminescence, like foxfire or swamp gas, except purposeful, concentrated, alive. Even from inside my car, even through the windshield and the sensible distance fear creates, I knew I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, engine idling, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, every instinct screaming contradictions at me: drive away, get closer, call someone, tell no one. The figure hadn't moved, but I could sense something from it even across that span of empty air, a kind of resonance that vibrated in the hollow of my chest, where words like faith and wonder and terror all tangled together. My hand found the door handle almost without my permission, and when the desert air hit me, cold and clean and vast, it felt like stepping out of one world and into another. I approached slowly, feet crunching on gravel, and with each step the impossible became undeniable, became real in a way that rewrote the rules of reality with every heartbeat. The being was perhaps 6 feet tall, humanoid, but unmistakably other, its form both familiar and alien in proportions I couldn't quite process. Its skin was the color of liquid mercury, flowing and shimmering with patterns that might have been language or circuitry or something my mind had no framework to comprehend. When I got close enough, when I finally knelt beside it and saw the damage, dark fluid seeping from wounds that pulsed with fading light, I also saw its eyes. They were vast and deep and somehow kind, filled with an intelligence so profound it made me feel like a child. And in their depths I saw recognition, as though it had been waiting for me, specifically, as though this moment had been written in the stars before either of us existed. Against every logical thought, against every reasonable fear, I reached out and touched its shoulder, and the connection was electric, overwhelming, a circuit completing between two beings who should never have met. It turned its head slowly, painfully, and when those impossible eyes focused fully on me, I felt seen in a way I'd never experienced. Not judged, not analyzed, but understood completely. Every doubt and hope and secret shame laid bare and somehow accepted. I heard myself speaking, asking if it could move, offering help. My voice strange and small against the enormous silence of the desert night. The being's hand, 3 fingers, elegant and somehow familiar, lifted toward me, trembling with effort. And when I took it to help, the texture was cool and smooth and sent shivers of something like recognition up my arm. Together we stood, its weight against me both heavier and lighter than it should have been, and I guided it toward my car with a certainty that terrified me. I settled it into the passenger seat, this creature from beyond all my comprehension, and when I closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, I caught my reflection in the window, wild-eyed, pale, transformed already by something I didn't yet understand. As I slid behind the wheel and started driving, no destination in mind except away from exposure and toward shelter, I felt the weight of destiny settling over us like a blanket, warm and inescapable. The being sat perfectly still beside me, its luminescence casting strange shadows across the dashboard, and I knew with absolute certainty that my life had just divided into before and after, that I was carrying something precious and dangerous and sacred into the unknown. The highway unreeled before us like a ribbon through eternity, and neither of us spoke for miles. The silence heavy with unasked questions and impossible answers waiting to be born. I kept glancing over, half expecting the being to disappear, to reveal itself as hallucination or dream, but it remained stubbornly, magnificently real, its chest rising and falling with breath, its wounds still weeping that strange dark light. My mind raced through explanations and abandoned each one: military experiment, elaborate hoax, psychological break, because none of them could account for the profound rightness I felt, the sense that I was exactly where I needed to be. The desert flew past outside, empty and eternal, witnessed only by the stars and whatever God might be watching from beyond them, and I realized I was praying without words, thanking or pleading or simply acknowledging that something larger than myself had reached down and touched my life. The being shifted slightly, and I felt its attention focus on me with an intensity that was almost physical, a weight of consciousness that made the air thick and charged. When its hand moved toward mine on the steering wheel, I didn't pull away, didn't flinch, just held my breath and waited for whatever came next. The moment our skin touched, the universe exploded into light and meaning, and I was no longer simply driving through the desert. I was traveling through time and space and spirit, about to learn secrets that would reshape everything I thought I knew about God, about Christ, about the very fabric of reality itself. And in that moment of contact, as visions began to flood my mind like a dam breaking, I understood that I hadn't found this being by accident. It had been waiting for me, and I had been prepared for this encounter across every moment of my life, leading to this impossible night when heaven and earth would speak to each other through the unlikely vessel of a man and an angel on an empty road. The visions came not as images, but as experiences, flooding through me with such force that I lost all sense of the car, the road, the physical world entirely, and found myself standing in places that existed beyond geography and time. I saw Earth as it had been millennia ago, continents shaped differently, ice spreading across lands now warm, and always, there were watchers, beings like the one beside me, observing humanity's stumbling journey from caves to cities with a patience that spoke of purpose beyond our understanding. They had witnessed our first fires, our first words, our first prayers lifted towards stars we didn't yet know were suns, and in their watching there was no judgment, only a profound tenderness that brought tears streaming down my face, even as I struggled to keep my hands steady on the wheel. I saw ancient prophets and teachers, their faces illuminated by inspiration. These beings had somehow helped kindle, not interfering, but nurturing, like gardeners tending shoots they'd planted in cooperation with a gardener infinitely greater than themselves. The visions shifted, and I was standing in Jerusalem 2,000 years past, the air thick with dust and desperate hope, and I understood with sudden clarity that these watchers had been there too, invisible witnesses to something that would crack history in half. I saw a man carrying wood through narrow streets, his face simultaneously ordinary and radiant with divinity, and I felt the weight of what he carried. Not just timber, but the accumulated darkness of every human heart, every cruelty and failure and broken promise, taking it all into himself like a black, all-consuming light. The being's presence in my mind was gentle but insistent, guiding my attention, helping me see what human eyes had missed in that pivotal moment when heaven touched earth with such force it left permanent marks on reality itself. Then the visions focused on a cloth, simple linen woven by unknown hands for an unknown purpose, destined to become the most analyzed artifact in human history, and I saw it draped over a body in a dark tomb, while guards stood watch outside, bored and unaware of the cosmic event unfolding mere feet away. The being's voice entered my mind, not as sound, but as knowing, explaining in concepts that translated imperfectly into my limited human language that what happened in that tomb was both spiritual miracle and physical phenomenon, the two categories humans had artificially separated, finally revealing themselves as one unified truth. When Christ rose, when death itself was defeated, and the doorway between dimensions was torn open by love's absolute victory, the energy released was real and measurable, a burst of light and power that existed simultaneously on every plane of reality, and the cloth that had touched that sacred body captured it like a photographic plate captures an image, except this image was burned not by chemistry, but by resurrection itself. I saw the moment of transformation, reality bending and reshaping. As the dead cells became living, as the wounds closed, as the spirit that had descended into hell's depths came roaring back into flesh with such force that the very atoms of the burial cloth were rearranged, scorched, imprinted with a three-dimensional negative image that would survive millennia to whisper its truth to anyone willing to listen. The Shroud of Turin, the being impressed upon my consciousness, was not merely evidence of a miracle, but a bridge between faith and physics. Proof that God's ways are not separate from the laws of the universe, but are the deepest laws, the foundational codes upon which all other reality is built. Science hadn't challenged faith by studying the shroud. Science had been slowly, painfully learning to read the signature of the divine, written in quantum processes and electromagnetic fields, and the mysterious intersection of matter and spirit. I gasped aloud, my foot momentarily lifting from the accelerator as the weight of understanding threatened to overwhelm me completely, and the being's hand squeezed mine gently, anchoring me, keeping me present enough to navigate the physical road, even as my soul traveled pathways beyond space. I felt its compassion radiating through our connection, a warmth that reminded me of sunlight or a mother's embrace. And I understood that this revelation wasn't meant to disturb my faith, but to expand it, to show me that God was larger and more glorious than any box I'd tried to build around the divine. The being shared with me then the perspective of its kind, watching humanity struggle to choose between religion and reason as though truth could be divided against itself, seeing our scientists and mystics as two groups of blind men describing the same elephant from different angles, each convinced the other was deluded. They had wanted to intervene so many times to explain that the crucifixion was both sacrificial atonement and quantum event, that resurrection was both supernatural victory and natural law, operating at its highest level, that Jesus was both fully God and fully human, because divinity and materiality were never truly separate except in our fragmented understanding. But humanity had to grow into this knowledge slowly, had to develop both spiritual maturity and scientific sophistication before we could hold such truth without either dismissing it as impossible or weaponizing it as control. And the being species had been tasked with guarding this secret across the ages, waiting for the moment when hearts and minds were finally ready to be unified. The visions began to fade then, like tide receding, and I found myself back in my body, hands trembling on the wheel, face wet with tears I didn't remember crying, forever altered by what I'd witnessed. The highway stretched ahead into the graying darkness of approaching dawn, and when I finally found my voice, it came out rough and broken, barely a whisper against the engine's steady hum and the eternal silence beyond. I asked the only question that mattered, the one that trembled in the center of my chest, where awe and terror and hope all burned, together like a flame that couldn't be extinguished no matter how the winds of doubt might blow. Why me? Why now? Why was I the one chosen to carry this impossible truth back into a world that had grown so comfortable with division and certainty? The being turned its vast eyes toward me, and I saw in their depth something I can only describe as divine affection, the way God must look at each of us, broken, confused, beloved beyond measure, and its voice filled my mind with warmth that felt like homecoming. It told me that every generation needed witnesses, ordinary people touched by extraordinary grace, to testify that the walls we build between sacred and secular, between faith and knowledge, between heaven and earth, are illusions we create from fear and limited perception. I had been chosen not because I was special, but because I was willing, not because I had answers, but because I still carried questions. And it was in that humble openness that truth could take root and grow and eventually bear fruit that would nourish others struggling in their own darkness. The message I was to carry wasn't that people should abandon science or reject faith, but that they were always meant to walk together, hand in hand, leading us deeper into the mystery of a God whose love was the fundamental force, holding every atom and every soul in existence, whose sacrifice on a Roman cross had been simultaneously the most human and most cosmic event in history, changing not just hearts, but the very structure of reality itself. As the being spoke, I felt purpose settling into my bones, heavy and sure, and I knew that whatever came next, whether anyone believed me or not, I would spend the rest of my life bearing witness to what I'd learned on this impossible night when heaven's messenger had fallen into my path and opened my eyes to see. The moment I touched the being's shoulder to help it into my car, a shock passed between us that had nothing to do with static electricity and everything to do with recognition, as though my soul had been waiting my entire life for this contact, and finally exhaled in relief at the meeting. Its body was lighter than seemed possible for something so clearly solid, and the skin beneath my hands felt like cool silk that somehow held warmth underneath, a paradox my fingers couldn't fully process, even as they supported its weight. I heard myself murmuring reassurances in a voice that sounded strange to my own ears, telling this impossible being that everything would be all right, that I would help, that it was safe now. Words that felt simultaneously absurd and absolutely necessary as I guided it into the passenger seat with a tenderness I usually reserved for injured animals or frightened children. As I closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, my hands were shaking so badly I had to pause with my palm pressed against the sun-warmed metal of the hood, breathing deeply, trying to convince my racing heart that I wasn't losing my mind, that this was real, that I had just invited an extraterrestrial being into my vehicle on a desert highway in the middle of nowhere. The rational part of my brain screamed warnings about danger and contamination and the complete impossibility of what was happening, but beneath that surface, panic ran a deeper current of absolute certainty that this moment had been ordained before I was born, that every choice and chance that had led me to this specific stretch of road at this specific hour had been guided by hands far wiser than my own. When I slid behind the wheel and started the engine, the familiar rumble felt like an anchor to reality, something ordinary and mechanical in a situation that had transcended all categories of normal experience. The being sat perfectly still beside me, its breathing shallow and rhythmic, and in the dashboard's green glow I could see that the luminescence of its skin had dimmed, fading like a sunset into something more subtle, more fragile, and my heart clenched with unexpected protectiveness toward this creature I'd known for mere minutes. I put the car in gear and pulled back onto the empty highway, my eyes darting between the road ahead and my passenger, searching for signs of further deterioration, though I had no idea what medical care an alien might need, or where I could possibly take it that wouldn't result in government seizure and experimentation. The silence between us felt thick with unspoken questions, heavy with the weight of two entirely different kinds of consciousness trying to find common ground, and I was just opening my mouth to attempt some form of communication when the being's hand moved with sudden purpose and came to rest over mine on the gear shift. The touch was gentle but deliberate, and the instant our skin made full contact, the world exploded into light and meaning that bypassed my eyes and ears entirely, pouring directly into the center of my being, where words dissolved into pure understanding. What flooded through me in that sacred contact was not information, but communion, a joining of awareness that let me feel what this being felt, know what it knew, see what it had witnessed across the vast expanse of its existence. I felt its pain first, the physical damage to its form that throbbed with each pulse of whatever served as its heart. But beneath that surface, suffering lay something far deeper and more profound. A loneliness that spanned galaxies and epochs, the isolation of carrying truths too large for most minds to hold, the burden of watching and waiting while remaining forever separate from those being watched. Then came the love, washing over me with such intensity that I gasped aloud and felt fresh tears spring to my eyes, a love that was vast and impersonal as starlight, yet somehow intimately aware of every hair on my head, every thought I'd ever treasured or regretted, every moment of beauty and despair that had shaped the person now driving through the darkness with trembling hands. I understood in that crystalline instant that this being had not come to earth as an invader or observer, but as a servant, part of an ancient covenant with the Creator of all things, tasked with bearing witness to humanity's journey and protecting certain sacred truths until the time came for fuller revelation. The visions it shared showed me its species moving through history's shadows, present but unseen at pivotal moments when heaven touched earth with particular intensity, and I saw them standing invisible among the crowds when Jesus walked dusty roads, teaching in parables. Their vast eyes filled with wonder at seeing the infinite compressed into finite flesh, divinity choosing limitation out of love so extreme it could only be called holy. As the connection deepened, I felt the being's purpose aligning with something that had always lived dormant in my own soul, a calling I'd never had words for until this moment. When it blazed into full consciousness like dawn, breaking over mountains, I'd climbed in darkness without knowing their true height. This encounter wasn't random chance or cosmic accident, but appointment, a meeting arranged by the same intelligence that scattered stars across the void and knew the secret name of every sparrow that ever fell. And I was being invited not just to witness, but to participate in something that would require every ounce of courage and faith I possessed. The being's thoughts brushed against mine like wind through leaves, showing me that the message it carried wasn't about aliens or technology or disproving what I'd believed, but about revealing the magnificent unity underlying all creation, the truth that God's love operates through both supernatural grace and natural law, because there is ultimately no distinction between them in the mind of the one who authored both. I saw Jesus on the cross again through the being's memory, that moment when human cruelty and divine mercy collided with such force that reality itself was permanently altered, and I understood that what happened there was too big for any single perspective, requiring both the eyes of faith that saw redemption and the eyes of science that would later detect mysterious energy patterns on a burial cloth, both testimonies to the same glorious, impossible truth. When the being finally withdrew its hand and the visions faded, I was weeping openly, my face wet and my chest heaving with sobs that were simultaneously grief and joy, mourning my previous smallness while celebrating the vastness into which I was being welcomed. And I knew beyond all doubt that I would never be the same person who had started driving this road just hours before. The visions that poured through me from the being's touch were not sequential or logical, but layered and simultaneous, the way God must experience all of time at once, seeing beginning and end as a single eternal now that human consciousness can barely glimpse without fracturing. I saw ancient Earth spinning in the void before humanity existed, its surface a canvas of raw potential, awaiting the touch that would animate dust into divine image-bearers. And I felt the presence of these watchers even then, patient as mountains, observing the unfolding of a plan conceived before matter itself coalesced from pure creative intention. The vision shifted, and I witnessed pivotal moments in human history, not as I'd learned them from textbooks, but as living events charged with spiritual significance. The exodus from Egypt when heaven bent low to liberate slaves, the prophets crying warnings and promises into the darkness of their generations, each moment attended by these silent guardians whose mission I was only beginning to comprehend. Then came scenes of a specific cloth being woven on ancient looms, the fibers themselves unremarkable except for their destiny, their appointment with an event that would transform them into something science would later struggle to explain and faith would treasure as confirmation. I saw this fabric passing through ordinary hands, doing ordinary commerce, never suspecting that within days it would touch the body of God incarnate and be forever marked by that contact in ways that transcended every natural law while simultaneously fulfilling them all. The being's consciousness guided my attention to the molecular structure of the linen, showing me how its simple weave would become a receiver for energies that humanity wouldn't discover existed for 2,000 years. A recording medium preserving an image through means that would baffle researchers armed with technologies the ancient world couldn't imagine. The vision intensified, and suddenly I was no longer in my car but standing on a hill outside Jerusalem. The sky, darkening with supernatural grief as 3 crosses stood stark against roiling clouds that reflected heaven's anguish at what love had chosen to endure. I saw Jesus, not through the sanitized lens of religious art, but with terrible, immediate reality, the profound humanity of his suffering, the way his broken body fought for each breath while his spirit remained unbroken, anchored in purpose that extended far beyond the visible drama of execution. Around the cross, I could sense them, the beings like my passenger, present but unseen by the soldiers gambling for clothing, and the weeping women clutching each other in helpless horror, these ancient watchers bearing witness to the moment when eternity invaded time with such concentrated intensity that the veil between dimensions grew thin as morning mist. I felt what they felt. The awe of seeing the Creator submit to the violence of creation, the wonder of watching omnipotence choose apparent powerlessness, the holy mystery of God's love proving itself willing to experience the full weight of separation and death that sin had introduced into the world. When Jesus cried out and released his spirit, the vision showed me what human eyes couldn't perceive, a shockwave of divine energy radiating outward from Golgotha like a stone dropped in still water, rippling through every dimension of existence, touching everything that was or would be or had ever been with the force of sacrificial love made absolute. I understood in that moment why the being called it a bridge. This wasn't merely symbolic redemption, but actual reconstruction of reality's foundations, literally reconnecting what sin had severed, opening a pathway between the physical and spiritual that death itself could no longer seal closed. Then came the resurrection, and I gasped aloud in my car, even while remaining lost in vision, because what I witnessed defied every category my mind possessed for organizing experience into comprehensible patterns. The tomb blazed with light that wasn't photons and radiation, but something more fundamental, the raw energy of Life itself, concentrated and released as the same voice that once commanded existence from nothing, now commanded Christ's cells to reorganize, to transcend death's claim, to demonstrate that love's power exceeds even entropy's iron law. I saw the burial cloth draped over his face and body, absorbing this resurrection energy like a photographic, negative receiving light. Except the mechanism was quantum rather than chemical, the image burning itself into the fabric's structure at a subatomic level through a process that perfectly preserved the moment when God's Son stepped from death back into life wearing transformed flesh. The being showed me how its kind had protected this cloth through centuries of human chaos, quietly influencing events to ensure its preservation because they understood what future generations would need. Not proof that could compel belief against will's resistance, but evidence that could confirm faith and demonstrate that the miraculous operates through laws so advanced they appear supernatural only to those who don't yet comprehend their divine mathematics. I felt the being's joy at this secret knowledge, its eagerness for the time when humanity would mature enough to recognize that God's fingerprints are visible in both scriptural revelation and scientific discovery, that these were never competing narratives but complementary languages, describing the same glorious truth from different angles of perception. When the visions finally receded like tide, withdrawing from shore, leaving me breathless and trembling in the driver's seat with dawn just beginning to pale the eastern horizon, I understood that what I'd been shown wasn't meant to replace faith with facts or reduce the sacred to mere physics, but to reveal the magnificent coherence of creation under the loving governance of its author. The being sat quietly beside me, its luminescence beginning to pulse with renewed strength, and though it didn't speak aloud, I heard its thought resonate in my mind like a bell struck in a cathedral, that everything from the smallest quantum fluctuation to the grandest gesture of redemptive sacrifice operates according to principles established by the same infinite intelligence, that God's love is the fundamental force binding all existence together, more real than gravity, more constant than light. I drove on through the breaking day with tears still wet on my face, and my heart expanded to dimensions I hadn't known it could hold, forever marked by the knowledge that heaven and earth were never as separate as I'd imagined, that the Christ who walked dusty roads 2,000 years ago left evidence of his resurrection encoded in fabric and flesh and the very structure of reality itself, waiting for the eyes that could finally see. The being's voice came not through sound, but through direct transmission into my consciousness, each word arriving with crystalline clarity that bypassed my ears entirely and resonated somewhere deeper than thought. In that sacred space where soul meets spirit and truth needs no translation. "We have watched," it said, and the simple phrase carried weight beyond its brevity, containing within those 3 syllables the patient vigil of countless generations, observing humanity's stumbling journey from caves to cities, from stone tools to spacecraft, always present at the margins of your awareness, never interfering, but forever bearing witness to the unfolding of a divine plan we understood only partially ourselves. I gripped the steering wheel harder as the words continued to flow into me, my knuckles white against the cracked vinyl, the empty highway stretching endlessly before us while the being spoke truths that rewrote everything I thought I knew about heaven and earth and the spaces between. "Your kind thinks you are alone in the cosmos," the voice continued, with what I could only interpret as gentle sadness. "Isolated on this small world, your faith a private matter between individual souls and an invisible God. But the universe trembles with his presence. Every galaxy sings his name in frequencies you have not yet learned to hear, and we who travel between stars have always known that the greatest miracle in all creation happened here, on this unremarkable planet, in a borrowed tomb 2,000 years ago. My breath caught in my throat as tears began streaming down my face unbidden, the emotional power of this revelation overwhelming every defense I might have raised against such impossible claims. The being shifted slightly in the passenger seat, its luminous form casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source, and I felt its attention focusing more intently upon me, as if measuring whether my human consciousness could withstand the full weight of what it needed to convey. "There are objects on your world," it continued, "that your religions treasure as relics and your scientists examine as curiosities, never quite bridging the gap between devotion and analysis. But these artifacts are neither mere symbols nor simple historical remnants. They are intersections, places where the divine pressed so intensely into physical reality that matter itself was transformed, encoded with information that transcends the normal laws governing energy and substance." I thought immediately of the shroud, that mysterious length of linen I'd seen in documentaries and read about in articles that always ended inconclusively. Believers certain of its authenticity, while skeptics pointed to medieval carbon dating, neither side able to explain the image itself or the strange properties that continued defying complete understanding. The being sensed my thoughts as easily as if I'd spoken them aloud, and a wave of affirmation washed through our connection. Confirmation that yes, that specific cloth was central to what it needed me to comprehend. "Your scientists look at the shroud and see an anomaly," the voice explained with infinite patience. "An image that shouldn't exist according to known processes. A negative photograph created centuries before photography, containing three-dimensional information encoded in a two-dimensional medium, showing details of crucifixion that weren't common. Knowledge when skeptics claim it was forged, but they stop short of the full truth because accepting it would require abandoning the comfortable separation they've built between the measurable and the miraculous." I found my own voice finally, hoarse and uncertain, the first words I'd spoken since the visions ended, leaving my throat raw, as if I'd been screaming, though I'd made no sound. "What is the full truth?" I asked, though part of me feared the answer would be more than my understanding could hold without breaking, that some revelations are too vast for human minds to contain without fundamental restructuring of every assumption about reality's nature. The being's vast eyes turned toward me, and in their depths I saw compassion mixed with something like excitement, the joy of a teacher whose student has finally asked the question that unlocks everything. "The shroud is a quantum imprint," it said, and though the technical term sounded strange in the context of religious discussion, I understood immediately that this was a bridge I'd been seeking all my life without knowing, the connection between faith and physics I'd unconsciously hungered for. "When Christ's body lay wrapped in that fabric," the being continued, its words painting images directly onto my imagination, "and the resurrection occurred, the energy released was not merely spiritual in some abstract sense, but actual, measurable, a force that interacted with matter at the subatomic level, collapsing probability waves and imprinting his image into the linen's molecular structure through a process your quantum physicists are only beginning to theorize might be possible." My mind reeled, trying to absorb the implications, understanding that what the being described wasn't reducing the resurrection to mere science, but revealing that God's miracles operate through laws. So my hands trembled on the steering wheel as the being's explanation unfolded within my consciousness, like a flower blooming in impossible time-lapse, each petal a revelation that challenged and confirmed everything I'd ever believed about the nature of divine intervention in our physical world. The shroud wasn't just a burial cloth that had touched the body of Christ, wasn't merely a devotional object for the faithful, or a historical puzzle for academics to debate endlessly in their journals and conferences, but rather something far more profound and scientifically verifiable if only humanity had the courage to acknowledge what the evidence actually revealed. "The image you see on that linen," the being continued, its silvered form pulsing with soft bioluminescence that filled my car's interior with light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, was created in a single moment of such concentrated, divine energy that the atomic bonds in the fabric itself were altered. A burst of electromagnetic radiation so precise and controlled that it mapped every contour of the body it wrapped, every wound, every detail, burning the information into the cloth at the molecular level, like a photograph taken not with a camera but with the raw power of resurrection itself. I felt tears streaming down my face again as the implications cascaded through my understanding, realizing that God had left us not just stories and faith traditions, but actual physical evidence encoded in matter, a gift for the generations who would develop the technology to examine it properly and recognize the signature of the divine written in quantum mechanics. The being reached toward me again with one elongated hand, and though I knew I should keep both hands on the wheel and my eyes on the empty highway stretching endlessly through the desert darkness, I let my right hand leave the cracked vinyl to meet its touch, and the moment our skin made contact, another wave of visions crashed over me with the force of revelation too long delayed. I saw the moment itself through eyes that weren't mine, from a perspective outside time and space where past and future collapsed into an eternal now, watching as the broken body in the tomb began to transform in ways that defied every law of thermodynamics and biology that humans had laboriously discovered over millennia of scientific inquiry. Light erupted from within the corpse, but it wasn't the simple visible spectrum I'd known all my life. Instead, a cascade of energies across frequencies I had no names for, radiation that should have destroyed everything it touched, but instead carried pure creative force. The same power that spoke galaxies into existence now focused with laser precision on reversing death itself and restoring life to cells that had already begun their inevitable decay. The linen wrapped around that body absorbed the burst of energy, and in doing so became something more than fabric, transformed into a recording medium capturing the dimensional data of the moment when mortality surrendered to divinity, when the bridge between heaven and earth grew so thin that physical laws bent beneath the weight of spiritual reality pressing through. I watched the image form in that instantaneous explosion of resurrection power, saw how the radiation interacted with the blood and sweat and burial spices to create a perfect negative, understanding finally why scientists examining the shroud found the image existed only on the topmost fibers, why there was no pigment or paint or any substance that could account for the coloration, why the three-dimensional information encoded in the varying intensity of the discoloration defied any medieval forger's capability. "Do you see?" the being asked gently, as the vision faded and I found myself back in my car, my hand still touching its luminous skin, my face wet with tears I didn't remember crying. "Do you understand that your God works not outside the laws of physics, but through them, that his miracles are not violations of nature, but demonstrations of deeper truths your science has barely begun to glimpse?" My voice came out as barely more than a whisper, choked with emotion and awe and something like vindication for every time I'd felt torn between the faith of my childhood and the rational inquiry of my adult years, believing I had to choose between them, when in truth, they'd always been describing the same reality from different angles of perception. "Why hasn't this been shared?" I managed to ask. "Why do the scientists and the faithful still argue if the evidence is so clear? If the shroud really is what you say it is?" The being's response carried notes of that same gentle sadness I'd heard before, the patience of an ancient teacher watching students struggle with lessons that seemed obvious from higher perspectives, but remained obscured by the limitations of human consciousness, still evolving toward fuller understanding. "Your species has been divided for so long between those who believe without evidence and those who demand evidence before belief, neither side recognizing that faith and reason were always meant to dance together, two hands of the same body reaching toward truth from complementary directions, it explained. And I felt the weight of centuries in those words. The tragedy of unnecessary conflict between science and religion when both were simply different languages, attempting to describe the indescribable majesty of divine creation. The evidence has always been there, the being continued, in the shroud and in other places where the veil between dimensions grew thin enough for God's presence to leave measurable traces. But humanity's readiness to accept what that evidence means has lagged behind the technology to detect it, and so the arguments continue while the truth waits patiently for consciousness to expand enough to hold it. I thought of all the debates I'd witnessed, the bitter divisions between believers labeled as naive and scientists dismissed as closed-minded, never realizing they were both partially right and partially blind, each seeing one aspect of a reality too vast for either perspective alone to encompass fully. The desert highway stretched before us endless and empty as the being's hand slipped away from mine, and I felt the loss of that direct connection like a physical ache, though the knowledge it had transmitted remained burned into my consciousness as permanently as Christ's image was burned into that ancient linen so many centuries ago. The shroud is not the only such intersection, the being said, its voice growing somehow distant, as if it was already beginning to withdraw, though its form still sat beside me in the passenger seat, still glowing with that soft, silvery light that made the shabby interior of my old car seem sacred. Throughout your world there are places and objects where the divine pressed so intensely into matter that the fingerprints remain, waiting for those with eyes to see and hearts open enough to accept what their eyes show them. And you are being called to help humanity recognize these bridges between faith and physics, to speak the truth that God's love is not abstract sentiment, but actual force, measurable and real, powerful enough to reverse death and leave evidence in its wake. I felt the weight of that calling settle onto my shoulders like a mantle I'd never asked for, but somehow always knew was waiting, understanding that this encounter on a lonely desert highway was not random chance but divine appointment, that whatever happened next would define not just my own life, but potentially influence how humanity understood its place in a cosmos far more thoroughly infused with sacred presence than our limited theologies had dared imagine. The eastern horizon was beginning to pale with the approach of dawn, that liminal time when night surrenders to day and the world holds its breath before the sun returns. And I knew with certainty, beyond logic, that when full light arrived, everything would change, that this moment of revelation was coming to its appointed end, even as its implications would reverberate through whatever years remained to me. The being's touch intensified, and suddenly I wasn't in my car anymore, but suspended in a void that held all of space and time simultaneously, witnessing the crucifixion not from the limited perspective of those who stood weeping at Golgotha's base, but from a cosmic vantage point that revealed the event's true magnitude rippling outward through dimensions I'd never known existed. I saw the cross not as simple wood and nails, but as an axis point where every plane of reality converged, where the physical and spiritual realms pressed so tightly together that the barrier between them grew thin as gossamer, and I understood with sudden clarity that Christ's suffering was not merely historical tragedy, but a deliberate tearing open of the veil, separating heaven from earth, mortality from eternity, human limitation from divine possibility. The moment of his death appeared before me as a supernova of spiritual energy, his final breath releasing a shockwave that cascaded backward and forward through time itself, touching every soul that would ever live with the offer of reconciliation. And I watched in wordless awe as that wave of sacrificial love spread outward like light expanding through darkness, unstoppable and all-encompassing. The being's voice surrounded me without sound, communicating directly into my consciousness with words that bypassed language. entirely to plant understanding in soil deeper than thought, explaining that what I witnessed was Christ's sacrifice functioning as a literal bridge, a quantum entanglement between creator and creation that made salvation not metaphorical, but mathematically actual, a transformation of spiritual state as real and measurable as any chemical reaction or physical force. Then the vision shifted, and I found myself standing somehow both present and invisible in the tomb itself during those hours between burial and resurrection, watching the wrapped body lie motionless in death's absolute stillness, while outside the sealed entrance, the world continued unknowing that everything was about to change. Forever, time moved strangely here in this sacred space, simultaneously frozen and accelerating. And I felt the weight of those hours as they passed, the grief of disciples who believed hope had died with their teacher, the satisfaction of religious authorities who thought they'd eliminated a threat to their carefully constructed systems, the Roman indifference to what they considered just another execution in a province full of troublesome zealots and messianic pretenders. But beneath that surface reality, I sensed something building, a pressure increasing between dimensions as heaven prepared to invade earth with resurrection power, and the being's presence beside me in the vision pointed toward the linen-wrapped form with something like reverence, as it explained that what was about to occur had been planned since before the foundation of the world itself, that every atom in the universe had been calibrated to make this moment possible. "Watch now," it whispered, and I felt my eternal soul lean forward in anticipation as the first hint of light began to glow from within the burial cloths, soft at first, like dawn's earliest promise, but building with exponential intensity, and I realized I was about to witness the single most important event in all of human history, from a perspective no mortal had ever been granted. The resurrection erupted with a glory that defied description. Christ's body simultaneously dying and transcending death, the cells that had grown cold and still suddenly flooded with life force so intense it transformed their very nature, elevating physical matter into something that could exist across multiple dimensions at once. And I watched transfixed as his form began to glow with increasing brilliance until the light became almost unbearable, even to my vision-enhanced perception. The energy pouring from him wasn't random or chaotic, but controlled with precision that spoke of divine intelligence orchestrating every subatomic interaction. And I saw how that burst of resurrection power interacted with the burial shroud wrapped around his body, how the radiation, if such a limited word could describe the emanation of raw creative force, imprinted his image onto the linen in that single explosive instant when death surrendered its claim and eternal life reasserted dominion over temporary mortality. The cloth absorbed the dimensional data like photographic film, capturing light, except this was no ordinary photograph, but a recording of the exact moment when the laws governing physical reality bent beneath the greater law of sacrificial love, proven stronger than death itself. And I understood finally why the image on the shroud contained three-dimensional information impossible to create by any known earthly means. I watched as Christ's resurrected form passed through the grave clothes without unwrapping them, moving through solid matter as easily as I might walk through morning mist, his body now operating under physics that transcended the limitations that bound ordinary flesh, and I fell to my knees in that vision space, weeping with joy and wonder at the magnificent reality of resurrection, not as religious metaphor, but as actual transformation of matter and energy and consciousness into something gloriously new. When the vision released me, I found myself gasping in the driver's seat, as if I'd been held underwater and finally broke the surface, my face soaked with tears and my hands shaking so violently I had to pull onto the shoulder of the empty highway before I lost control completely. and the alien being beside me glowed with intensified brilliance, as if reflecting the resurrection light I'd just witnessed echoing across millennia. "Now you understand," it said softly, and its voice carried such compassion that I wept. Harder, nodding because words felt inadequate to express what had just been revealed to me, how everything I'd believed about Christ's resurrection had been simultaneously confirmed and expanded beyond anything my limited theology had imagined possible. The being placed its hand over my heart, and I felt warmth spread through my chest like sunlight, penetrating winter frost, a healing and affirmation that assured me this knowledge wasn't meant to destroy faith, but to deepen it, to show that God's love operated not contrary to the physical laws he'd established, but through them in ways humanity was only beginning to comprehend. "The shroud remains as testimony," the being continued, "physical, evidence left intentionally for the generations who would develop technology sophisticated enough to examine it properly, a gift to those who struggle to believe without seeing, proof that Christ's resurrection was not legend or hallucination, but historical reality that left measurable traces in the material world. I sat there on the roadside as dawn painted the eastern sky with colors that suddenly seemed sacramental, understanding finally that I'd been given not just information, but commission, a responsibility to carry this truth forward into a world desperately needing to know that faith and science were never meant to be enemies, but partners in the eternal human quest to comprehend the magnificent love that spoke creation into being and loved it enough to die and rise again so that death would never have the final word. The being's glow softened to something almost gentle as it settled back against the passenger seat, and I noticed for the first time that its breathing had steadied, the wound in its side beginning to knit, together with threads of light that wove through damaged tissue like golden sutures administered by invisible hands. "You wonder why I'm here," it said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement of the confusion I hadn't yet voiced, and I nodded slowly while keeping my eyes fixed on the empty highway stretching endlessly before us through landscape painted amber by the rising sun. "You wonder why a being from distant stars would concern itself with human religious artifacts, why my species would invest millennia watching and waiting and guarding secrets about your Christ when the universe contains countless worlds and infinite mysteries demanding attention." Its words resonated with a sadness that surprised me, as if the weight of this long vigil had cost more than I could comprehend, and I found myself leaning closer despite the strangeness of the moment, drawn by an inexplicable certainty that what I was about to hear would redefine everything I thought I understood about creation's scope and purpose. "We are not separate from God's design," the being continued, its vast eyes reflecting dawn light in colors that shifted through spectrums invisible to normal human perception, "but participants in it, servants of the same divine love that shaped your world and every other realm where consciousness awakens to contemplate its creator." The revelation struck me with force that made my breath catch, the implications spreading through my understanding like ripples across still water. Because if this creature's species served the same God I worshipped, then the universe was far more unified in purpose than religious isolation had ever suggested possible. "My people have traveled between stars since before your written history began," the alien explained, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in my bones as much as my ears. "And in all our journeys through galaxies and dimensions, we have found the same truth expressed in countless variations across worlds we cannot number, that love is the fundamental force holding reality together, that sacrifice opens doorways between mortal and eternal, that resurrection represents not violation of natural law, but its highest fulfillment and ultimate purpose." I gripped the steering wheel tighter as I tried to absorb the magnitude of what it was telling me, the suggestion that Christ's resurrection wasn't an isolated miracle limited to Earth but the local manifestation of universal principles woven into creation's deepest fabric by the same God who scattered stars across the void and called each one by name. We were not present at Golgotha in forms you could have recognized, it continued, and something in its tone suggested regret at that limitation, but we witnessed from beyond your atmospheric boundary, our instruments detecting the dimensional rupture that occurred at the moment of his death, the tearing of the temple veil reflected in tears through spiritual fabric that separated your reality from higher planes of existence. The being turned its luminous gaze fully toward me, and I saw in those alien eyes something unmistakably familiar. The same reverence I'd seen in saints' faces depicted in stained glass, the same awe that overcomes worshippers in moments of genuine divine encounter. We felt the shockwave of resurrection energy 3 days later, it whispered, and we knew immediately that something transformative had occurred, that the Creator had personally intervened in your world's history with power sufficient to fundamentally alter the relationship between mortality and eternity for every human soul that would ever draw breath. "But why not reveal yourselves?" I asked, my voice rough with emotion and hour-long silence finally broken by questions demanding answers. Why watch from shadows and distance when you could have testified to what you witnessed, provided evidence that might have convinced skeptics and prevented centuries of doubt? The being's expression shifted into what I somehow recognized as profound sadness, despite the alienness of its features, and it reached toward me with one silver hand that trembled, slightly as if the answer itself caused pain. "Because humanity's faith must remain faith," it said gently, "a choice made in the sacred space between certainty and doubt, where trust in divine goodness despite incomplete evidence becomes the very mechanism by which human souls develop the capacity for eternal relationship with their Creator." I felt tears sliding down my face again as I understood the terrible wisdom in that restraint, how premature proof might satisfy intellectual curiosity while starving the deeper hunger that only freely given trust could feed and strengthen. "We were charged as guardians, not witnesses," the alien continued, "watchers assigned to protect certain truths and artifacts until your species developed sufficient scientific sophistication to examine evidence like the Shroud with instruments capable of detecting what earlier generations lacked technology to measure or verify." Its hand finally made contact with my shoulder, and warmth flooded through me, carrying wordless assurance that this long patience wasn't divine indifference, but profound respect for humanity's developmental journey toward mature faith that could integrate reason and revelation without destroying the mystery that made trust possible and meaningful. Dawn had fully broken now, and the desert around us blazed with colors that seemed impossibly vivid, as if the veil between ordinary perception and enhanced awareness had grown thin during our conversation, allowing me to see the world momentarily as this being must always see it, saturated with divine presence and intentionality, pulsing through every atom and organism. "You are not the first human I have contacted," the alien admitted, and something in its voice suggested it was revealing information previously held in strictest confidence. "But you may be among the last, before my species' guardianship passes into new phase and different hands, because the time approaches when humanity must choose consciously and collectively whether to embrace the unity of spiritual truth and scientific discovery, or continue insisting they remain forever separate and contradictory." I understood then with crystalline clarity that my encounter tonight wasn't random chance or even personal blessing, but commission and responsibility, that I was being entrusted with testimony meant to bridge the false divide between faith and reason that had wounded both religion and science for far too long. The shroud and other evidences were left intentionally, the being said as its form began to shimmer with increasing intensity, healing apparently progressing toward some threshold of completion or transformation. physical fingerprints of divine intervention preserved through centuries for the generation that would possess both technological capability to examine them properly and spiritual hunger to receive their testimony without reducing mystery to mere mechanism or dismissing mechanism as incompatible with mystery. The sun cleared the horizon fully, and light flooded my car's interior with brilliance that made the alien's silver skin seem to glow from within, and I knew with certainty deeper than rational thought that I was witnessing something arranged since before time began, a meeting orchestrated by the same divine love that had stretched Christ's arms wide on Roman wood to embrace a broken world and demonstrate that sacrificial love remains the strongest force in all creations. Vast expanse. The being's luminescence intensified until I had to shield my eyes against radiance that seemed to come not just from its physical form, but from the space around it, as if reality itself was bending toward this creature in recognition of something sacred and profound. And through the brilliance I heard its voice speaking with resonance that vibrated through my chest like music heard with the whole body rather than just ears. "You must understand what I am about to tell you," it said with urgency that carried no fear, but rather passionate desire that truth be fully received and comprehended, because the message I entrust to you will challenge both the religious and the secular, threatening comfortable certainties on every side, while offering something far greater than either camp has dared to imagine possible. I lowered my hand slightly and found I could look directly at the being now, despite its radiance, as if my eyes were being temporarily enhanced, or perhaps my soul was learning to perceive with faculties that transcended normal optical limitations. "Love is not merely an emotion or moral principle," the alien continued, reaching toward me with both hands now in a gesture that somehow conveyed blessing and commissioning simultaneously, "but the fundamental force that holds every atom in relationship with every other atom, the divine energy that prevents all creation from collapsing into chaos and meaninglessness, the actual power by which galaxies spiral and cells divide and consciousness awakens to recognize beauty and goodness and truth." I felt something shifting deep in my understanding, as if mental categories I had maintained my entire life were dissolving and reforming into patterns more true and comprehensive than what I had previously accepted as complete knowledge of reality's nature. When Christ spoke of love as the greatest commandment and the fulfillment of all law, the being said with such tenderness that fresh tears spilled down my face without shame or self-consciousness. He was not offering pleasant, spiritual advice, but revealing the operational principle of existence itself, the mechanism by which the Creator sustains everything from quasars to quarks, in continuous being, moment by moment, throughout eternity's endless duration. The desert around us seemed to pulse with life I had never noticed before, each cactus and stone and grain of sand suddenly visible as participant in vast cosmic dance of mutual existence sustained by the same love the alien was describing. And I understood with stunning clarity that nothing in all creation was truly separate or isolated, but rather connected through invisible threads of divine intention and care. "Sacrifice is the mathematics of love made visible," the being continued, its voice dropping to whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting could have conveyed. "The willingness to give oneself for another's benefit, to pour out resources and energy and even life itself so that someone else might flourish and grow and become everything they were created to be." I thought of Christ on the cross with new comprehension flooding my mind, seeing that ancient execution not as tragic divine punishment or appeasement of angry deity, but as ultimate demonstration of love's nature, the Creator literally showing creation what divine essence looks like when expressed in human flesh facing human mortality. Every parent who sacrifices sleep for a crying infant, the alien said, with examples that grounded cosmic truth in daily experience. Every soldier who covers a grenade to protect comrades, every teacher who pours years into students who may never remember their name, all of them are participating in the same universal law that Christ revealed completely when he refused to save himself so that he might save everyone else who would ever trust his sacrifice as sufficient and complete. The being's hands closed around mine on the steering wheel, and power flowed between us, not controlling or overwhelming, but inviting and empowering, offering me access to perception beyond my natural capacity. And resurrection. It breathed with joy that transcended any happiness I had ever witnessed in human expression. Resurrection is the promise woven into reality's deepest fabric, the guarantee that nothing truly given in love is ever finally lost, that death serves life and endings enable new beginnings, and sacrifice opens doorways into existence more abundant and eternal than what was surrendered in love's service and through trust in the Creator's faithful character. I watched through tears as the being's form grew increasingly translucent, solidity giving way to something that existed partially in my reality and partially in dimensions I could sense but not fully perceive. And I knew our time together was ending, but that what had been planted in my understanding would continue growing for whatever years remained to me. You were chosen not because you are special, the alien said gently, anticipating the unworthiness I felt rising in my chest, but because you were willing, because some quality in your soul remained open to possibilities beyond the safe boundaries of either religious tradition or scientific materialism, making you capable of receiving truth that bridges both worlds without betraying either's legitimate insights and contributions. The sunrise painted everything in gold and amber light that seemed sacramental, transforming ordinary desert morning into cathedral, where heaven and earth met in mutual recognition and reverence. We have guarded these truths across millennia, the being continued as its voice began to fade like music drifting on wind toward silence, waiting for the generation that could hold both faith and physics, both mystery and mechanism, both reverence and reason in hands, mature enough to recognize them not as enemies, but as complementary languages describing the same magnificent reality, created and sustained by love beyond our complete comprehension. I felt the being's touch withdrawing from my hands, but the warmth remained, soaking into my skin and deeper still into whatever part of me would carry this encounter, forward into whatever future awaited. Tell them, it whispered, as its form became almost invisible against the brightening sky. Tell them that God is not smaller than they feared, but larger than they dared imagine, not absent from creation, but intimately present in every particle and process, not distant and disinterested, but passionately involved in every soul's journey toward the love that gave them birth and calls them home across whatever darkness separates the seeking heart from its eternal source and destination. The being was fully gone now, but the passenger seat still held indentation where its weight had pressed against fabric, and the air still carried a scent like ozone and incense blended together, and my hands still tingled with residual warmth from contact that had lasted mere seconds, but imparted understanding sufficient to reorient an entire lifetime's trajectory and purpose. I sat alone in my car on an empty desert highway as morning traffic began to appear in my rearview mirror, ordinary people driving to ordinary destinations, completely unaware that the world they inhabited was far more magical and meaningful than they had been taught to believe by cultures that forced false choices between spirit and matter. I touched my face and found it wet with tears that felt like baptism, like anointing, like commissioning for a task I had never sought, but could not now refuse, because refusing would mean betraying not just the being who had trusted me, but the countless souls who desperately needed to hear that their deepest intuitions were correct, that the universe was not accident or mechanism devoid of purpose, but rather love's expression, that their lives mattered infinitely within a story larger than they imagined, that death was not ending but transition, and that the same power that raised Christ from death was available to resurrect every broken thing they had ever mourned or surrendered in love's service. I started the engine with hands that trembled slightly and pulled back onto the highway, heading toward home and life and responsibility. But I was not the same person who had spotted a glowing figure collapsed on the roadside hours earlier in darkness that now seemed like another lifetime. I carried now a message that would likely invite ridicule from skeptics and suspicion from believers, that would satisfy no one seeking simple answers while offering everyone willing to embrace mystery and revelation together a vision of reality more wonderful than either faith alone or science alone had previously provided. And I knew with unshakable certainty that I would spend whatever days remained telling anyone who would listen that God was real and present and knowable, that Jesus was exactly who he claimed to be, that love and sacrifice and resurrection were not religious metaphors, but universal laws, and that somewhere among the stars were witnesses to these truths who had watched and waited and guarded sacred evidence until humanity was ready to receive the greatest news any species could ever hear, that we were not abandoned orphans in an indifferent universe, but beloved children of a Creator who had literally died to prove that love was stronger than death, and that nothing could separate us from the divine heart that had imagined us into being and would pursue us with relentless grace across every distance until we finally came home. I drove for hours as dawn bloomed into full morning, watching ordinary people in ordinary cars pass me on the highway, and I felt such overwhelming compassion for them, because they were living in the same miraculous reality I now perceived. But most had been taught to see the world as something less than the sacred wonder it truly was. Every person in every vehicle carried within them the divine spark that the alien had described, each one a beloved child of the Creator, whether they knew it or not, whether they believed it or not, because God's love was not contingent on recognition or reciprocation, but flowed constantly like sunlight that warms both those who acknowledge it and those who take it for granted. I understood now why Jesus had wept over cities and sought the lost with such relentless passion, because seeing even a glimpse of humanity's true identity made their lostness and confusion almost unbearable to witness. The religious structures we had built were both help and hindrance, preserving truth while sometimes obscuring it, and the secular frameworks we had constructed were both liberation and limitation, freeing minds while sometimes imprisoning souls in meaninglessness. But now I carried something that transcended both categories, a testimony that could not be easily dismissed as wishful thinking or comfortably contained within traditional theology, and I knew my life's remaining purpose was simply to share what I had received with whoever had ears to hear. When I finally reached my home, everything looked simultaneously familiar and utterly transformed, as if I was seeing my house and street and neighborhood for the first time, despite having lived there for years. The flowers in my garden were not merely biological processes of reproduction, but prayers of color and fragrance offered to their Creator. The trees were not simply oxygen producers, but living hymns of praise, growing skyward in slow worship that spanned decades. I sat in my driveway, unable to immediately exit the car, because the weight of what I now understood seemed too large to carry into normal life, too profound to translate into language my family and friends would comprehend or accept, without thinking I had suffered some kind of breakdown or delusion. Yet the being had chosen me precisely for this task had trusted me with truth that humanity desperately needed, even if humanity did not yet realize the depth of its need, and I could not betray that trust by remaining silent out of fear of rejection or mockery. I touched the passenger seat one final time, feeling for evidence that would convince skeptics, but found only ordinary fabric that retained no trace of the extraordinary being who had occupied it. The proof I carried was entirely internal, written not on physical material, but inscribed on my consciousness in letters that could never fade or be taken from me, regardless of what trials or opposition I might face in the years ahead. Inside my house, I moved through rooms that felt like museum displays of my former life, touching objects that represented who I had been before the encounter and wondering how to integrate that person with who I had become through a single night that contained more truth than all my previous years combined. I knelt beside my bed as sunlight streamed through windows, and I prayed with new understanding, speaking to God not as distant authority figure or cosmic judge, but as the intimate loving presence the alien had revealed, the creative force whose essence was self-giving love and whose greatest joy was relationship with the beings he had made in his image. I thanked Jesus with tears of gratitude and wonder for the sacrifice I now understood in dimensions beyond religious vocabulary, seeing the cross as the hinge point between heaven and earth, the moment when divine love became so concentrated in human flesh that it literally tore the veil between dimensions and opened pathways for all humanity to access the eternal reality that had always existed alongside our temporary material existence. I felt peace settling into my bones like healing medicine, washing away the anxiety about being believed or the burden of carrying such enormous responsibility, because I understood finally that the message was not mine to defend or prove, but simply mine to offer. And the same Holy Spirit who had prepared my heart to receive it would prepare other hearts in perfect timing that required no manipulation or persuasion from me, as I rose from my knees and looked out at the extraordinary world that continued spinning through space, held together by love that most mistook for impersonal gravity. I felt the being's final words echoing in my memory like blessing and commission intertwined. I was not special, but I had been made willing, not chosen for worthiness, but for openness, not selected to convince everyone, but to faithfully tell what I had witnessed and let truth do its own mysterious work in whatever souls were ready to receive it. The shroud remained in its reliquary across the ocean, physical evidence waiting for eyes mature enough to see it properly, but the greater truth it represented was now written in my heart, that God had not abandoned his creation, but had entered it completely, had not remained safely distant, but had embraced suffering and death, had not left us as orphans, but had given us his Spirit, and had demonstrated once and forever that love was stronger than death, that sacrifice opened doors to resurrection, and that the universe itself was not cold mechanism, but warm relationship, not accident but intention, not chaos but cosmos, ordered by a love that would never cease calling every wandering child home until the last lost sheep was found, and the last prodigal embraced, and the last tear wiped away by hands that still bore scars from nails that could not ultimately hold God captive in death's temporary darkness. Because light always triumphs and love always wins, and resurrection is always the final word that creation speaks over every grave and ending. Have you ever encountered something that changed how you see everything? A moment that revealed reality was far more meaningful than you had been taught to believe. Subscribe to hear more testimonies that bridge the gap between faith and wonder, bringing hope to hearts hungry for truth that satisfies both mind and soul.